First, we start by adding 10 grams of dry yeast to a container, followed by 30 grams of salt. Next, I added room temperature water and mixed it all together to dissolve the salt and yeast. This is a 70% hydration dough, which equates to 700 grams of water in my case, since I am using 1 kilogram of flour. Once the salt was dissolved, I added 1 kilogram of all-purpose flour, which was enough to make 2 medium-sized focaccia breads for me. To form a dough, I started by mixing everything in the container with a spoon, just to get it generally mixed together. Once it was too difficult to continue mixing with a spoon, I transferred the dough onto a clean bench and began kneading. First, I had to slowly mash the mixture together until there was no visible dry flour. I could then start to knead the dough using the slap and fold technique. I kneaded this dough for about 5 minutes, scraping the dough back into one cohesive mound whenever it became too sticky on the bench top. Eventually, I got a fairly smooth dough ball that I was happy with. At this point, I used the dough scraper to form this into a tight ball before putting it into the container and covering it with the lid. This was then left to rest at room temperature for about 1 hour. After it had rested, I took it out of the container and back onto the bench top, where I gave it 4 folds, 1 fold from each side. At this point, the dough was much smoother, stronger, and less sticky on the countertop. Once I folded the dough, I formed it into a tight ball once again and placed it back into the container and covered it with the lid. This time the dough went into the fridge overnight for a slow fermentation. It is now the next day and I am ready to bake the focaccias. First, I drizzled a little olive oil onto my baking trays and spread this out to coat the bottom and sides of the tray. I also drizzled a little on the bench top and spread it out to prevent any of the dough sticking to the bench. As we can see, the dough has approximately doubled in size overnight. I emptied the dough onto the area with the olive oil and formed it into a tighter rectangle shape to make it easier to work with. I then weighed and evenly separated the dough into 2, since I am making 2 focaccias. I folded each dough ball to form a rectangle shape and further tightened it in my hands to get a smooth oval-shaped ball. These then went into the baking trays, and I drizzled some more olive oil on top of each ball and patted this over the surface of the dough to prevent the plastic wrap sticking to it. Each tray was then covered tightly in plastic wrap and left to sit at room temperature for another 1 to 2 hours. While the dough was resting, I prepared my toppings. For these focaccias, I chose to make a garlic and rosemary topping. To do this, I finely zested 2 large cloves of garlic and put them into a small glass bowl. To this bowl, I added 1 teaspoon of dried rosemary, about half a teaspoon of black pepper, half a teaspoon of salt, and a good amount of olive oil. I then mixed this all together with a spoon to form a paste which I used for a topping on the focaccias. After about 1 to 2 hours, the dough was ready to be shaped and topped. I did this by pressing the dough down with my fingertips until it covered the bottom of the baking tray at a fairly even thickness. When it was almost fully shaped, I added half the paste to each focaccia and spread it evenly across the surface with my hands. I then finished the shaping of the focaccia while simultaneously pressing the topping into the dough and spreading it around evenly. Once this was completed for both focaccias, I covered them in the same plastic wrap, letting them rest for a final 10 minutes before baking. During this time, I preheated the oven to 230 degrees Celsius, so by the time the focaccias were ready to be baked, the oven was up to temperature. Once rested, the focaccias went into the oven for about 15 to 20 minutes. Once baked, I immediately took them out of the tray and placed them onto a cooling rack. These need to cool for a minimum of around 20 minutes. Once cooled, the focaccias were ready to cut and eat. And this is what I ended up with: some nice open crumb focaccia bread with a rosemary garlic topping.